because I say this a lot of people take this the wrong way, especially people who have spiritual ego, right? With, oh, I know so many things, and have you read this book, and have you read that book, and yada yada. If you have a guru, or let's say like a spiritual master or teacher or whatever, ask them, what is the meaning of life? What is the function of living? And if they cannot, like, two things, okay? If they cannot give you an objective meaning, an objective truth, that's one. And two, if they cannot prove the meaning of life and the proof of God's existence, then they are a fraud. And people hate when I say this. People hate when I say this, but how can I not say it when I know that there is objective proof?
The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Vitruvian Podcast, a podcast about the pursuit of truth and personal renaissance. I'm your host, Zach Shenkin. Today, I'm joined by Jack of Faces. Jack is a face reading, physiognomy expert and lifelong mystic. He's also a trained psychologist and behavioral therapist, so his knowledge spans across both the very material and practical, all the way to the metaphysical and esoteric. I'm super excited about our conversation today. Jack, welcome to the show, bro.
Thank you, man. Thank you, Zach, for having me. Let's do it. Very interested.
Yeah, I'm super excited about the conversation today. I think you're definitely more of a niche character, and super, super deeply knowledgeable. I think it was like complete happenstance that I even came across some of your content on Twitter, and it was a post that you made basically saying, "Hey, drop a picture of your face, and I'll reply to you with a message." And I actually ended up writing a newsletter on my email list about the kind of experience, because it was very like a very synchronistic experience in my life, like the timing. And your reply to my photo was just something to the effect of "listen to the water." Like that was the only thing you said,
Yeah.
and I don't know, something about that like triggered something deep in me, like blood memories. Something back. I was reading a lot into genet genetic history and potential Atlantean roots and these things. So it was something that it just piqued my curiosity. So I think I shot you a DM and was like, "Yo, can you tell me anything more?" And you're like, "Your face, your face just aligns with water." And I'm interested to go more into that. So that kind of the way I want to structure today's conversation is, I think at first I want to ask a little bit about your origin, just so people have an idea of where you come from, how you got into this space, where your knowledge kind of comes from. But I also want to use this time to demonstrate a little bit about your capacity. I recently did an episode with a friend named Chris, who's kind of a numerology expert, and we used him reading my numerology and charts and things to both demonstrate exactly like what the skills are, but also kind of teach through that. And I think similarly, we can do a bit of a face reading, if you will, and you can even explain what that is. But before we get into all that, a little bit about yourself. I know it's a lazy question, but I think it's important. Tell me what I need to understand about Jack to understand how you got to the place where you're doing face readings and understanding the art of physiognomy and all this other esoteric stuff. A little bit about the origin story.
Um, awesome. So I guess it's difficult for me to say, like I'm just a normal person, in many ways, but in some other ways I'm not. And I feel like I've never really been, even though normalcy seems to be, I guess, the primary pursuit for most people, and most, young people, as you're growing up, you want to sort of like find where you fit in. And, that was initially a struggle for me because I was always sensitive in non-traditional ways. I would say I've always been very temperamental, emotional, sensitive to energy. So it's sort of ironic now, I guess, that I tried to aid people and help them to sort of understand what their imprint is, and sort of like what kind of energy they carry and what they're sensitive to. Um, but I'm from a very small, relatively unknown mountainous um, region of the world, the Caucasus Mountains. It's a very, very mystical place with it has an amazing mythos and a surprisingly rich and deep esoteric tradition that, let's say, I've come to know over time. Um, I also come from a family, I guess, um, that um, has had either ties or experiences on the genetic level with the irrational. So it's always been a sort of non-conscious part of my life. Um, and I got into physiognomy, not through some, I guess, blessed exchange with the universe, but I got into it mm, for, let's say, all the wrong reasons. Um, one of which um, being hyperfixation on micro expressions and hyperfixation on predicting behavior. Um, Now, obviously, people who are versed in behavioral psychology, maybe, or behavior in general, will sort of understand that usually that's a trauma response to life, and that was what initially spawned my fascination. Um, when it comes to physiognomy and face reading. Um, and physiognomy itself, what I like to call it face reading, I don't like to call it physiognomy for some reason. I don't even know why. Um, it is the formulaic and intuitive art of interpreting a person's physiognomy as a symbol or metric of energy, temperament, energetic type, mental mapping, sort of like a behavioral map, a temperamental map that you can read, like any other thing, like, let's say, palm reading exists, right? It's a similar recipe. It's just incredibly more complex, and it sort of assumes the art itself assumes that the face is the map of the soul, I guess, to put it in a more poetic sense.
That's beautiful. And so, for those that don't know, when you describe the term physiognomy, this is like the facial structure of someone's face itself, like the idea that some part of their soul, spirit, character expresses itself through the actual structure of somebody's face, like the distance between the eyes, cheekbone, where they wear their, frown lines, all these different sorts of things. Is
Yes,
that correct?
yes, 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 absolutely. And I think it's very important to also understand that um, the lines get blurred sometimes between what I call the woo woo and the empirical, right? And I'm someone who has, let's say, I've gone through classic academia, so I know what the importance is when it comes to having something that's formulaic and something that can be objectively and empirically proven and researched. Um, so it's very important when it comes to face reading to understand that it is a formulaic art. So it's based in evolutionary biology and psychology, right? For the most part, it also has an intuitive element, but we don't just want to. Well, I don't just want to say that, oh, there's some strange mechanism that exists beyond the veil that connects the soul to the face somehow, and we don't know how it works. No, we know exactly what the mechanism behind it is. It's an evolutionary mechanism. It's just a symbology that we didn't know that we could read, and some people intuitively read faces as well. Sometimes you'll see a person you don't trust for some reason. Sometimes you'll meet someone and you have immediate trust. All of these things or traits or features, they're picked up from the face.
Interesting. And I also want to kind of call out that while this may play into the understanding of physiognomy, I think it's often undersimplified, especially on the timeline, and I'm sure this bothers you, but a lot of people essentially distill it down to like ugly people bad, attractive people good. And while I think the world at large does benefit from beauty, and I think having aesthetic standards is important, something I talk about a fair amount, resonate with kind of the classic Helene ideal in that sense. It is an oversimplification, if I'm correct, that like just simply having kind of distorted or hideous features makes you
Yeah.
somehow a bad person, and likewise, all people with quote unquote attractive features are, of high moral character or something like
Yeah.
that.
Well, you've been following my account, and you know that this bothers me a lot, right? It's yeah, obviously we can't expect people to be learned and educated in every field, but a very good metric to sort of determine the the level of awareness when it comes to a specific subject, let's say in this case physiognomy, is how shallow the conclusions are, right? And some of the conclusions that we see when it comes to physiognomy, I feel like physiognomy has largely become this weird sensationalist niche thing where people can just say, oh, you have this type of nose or you have that type of jaw, and you have this feature, and then you're good, and then you don't. And I always tell them, like, my friend, this is you know thousands upon thousands of years of evolutionary progression and advancement. For you to say that something is evolutionary inferior is an incredibly vicious statement, right? It's so ambitious in a scientific sense, that it almost becomes uh, it almost becomes difficult to take seriously. And I'll try to explain why. um the human body genetically is predisposed to only one thing: long-term survival, right? Because long-term survival um is the primary metric um when it comes to winning the evolutionary game. And this is for the human body, not for the human spirit. The evolutionary game is, let's say, to reproduce, right? As much as you're able. Now, are there different tactics and strategies that the body employs for survival? Yes. Right? Are there different features and traits that might be superior in one sense and inferior in another sense? Yes. Are there archetypal energies that are sort of symbolically represented on the face that are beyond the idea of just evolutionary survival? Yes, absolutely. And we can get into all of that sort of like juicy, chunky information when it comes to face reading. Um, but firstly, I think it's very important to determine that most knowledge and most guidebooks when it comes to physiognomy, um, and for the lack of a better way of saying it, in my mind, is bullshit, and it's a lot of sensationalism. And it's a lot of sensationalism when it comes to, oh, the sort of like the Europoid physiognomy against the Arabic physiognomy and the Asiatic physiognomy and what it means. These people don't know anything they're talking about, because the degree of depth that this subject has, you can't boil it down to X is good and Y is worse. Another cool thing, I guess, about face reading that I can share is that the genetic imprint, so let's say the DNA, um, and the execution of that DNA are two separate things. So let's say DNA holds information, it perfected information about someone's, genetic code and their physiognomy. But how the physical body then materializes and manifests that, so how well it is executed, right, within the three-dimensional world, that's completely different as well. So you get these inconsistencies, what we call imperfections, right? So we get non-symmetry. uh, Sometimes we get lack of symmetry, sometimes we get a little bit less, a little bit more. All of these things are, how to say, symptoms of living in the three-dimensional world, where our genetic code is becomes subjected to, faulty execution, not faulty design, but faulty execution, which is fascinating too, right?
Yeah, tons to touch on there. I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that. And I kind of want to, I'll pose a question after I make a statement. But yeah, I think a lot of people in multiple verticals, but especially say in health, will often use genetics as cope, essentially saying like I have either good or somebody else has better genetics. That's why they have, this express potential, this sort of physique, this uh, ability, their IQ, their height, and certain things are obviously more or less malleable. It's a lot harder to change your eye color, for instance, than it would be to have a six pack abs. A lot there's varying degrees of our ability to change genetic expression, but I'm a believer that almost everything is up for some amount of negotiation. And even if it is just a mental paradigm to adopt, believing that it's within your control certainly makes you a more powerful individual. But on the backside of this, as far as the art and science of studying faces, how does someone like yourself, like an expert that is trying to discern patterns and archetypes and features, account for, like you just described, like the malleability of somebody's face? If I know that if somebody's eating a bunch of Zog slop, living under blue light, having no mission, no purpose, they're going to look kind of like a mongoloid version of their highest potential. They're going to be inflamed, they're going to be pale, they're going to be puffy, versus the kind of golden, attractive Chad version of themselves that exists under the surface if they were in an ideal lifestyle. How do you kind of account for those two differences? Because I mean, people post transformation pictures in their health transformations, and it's like almost looking at two different human beings.
Yes.
Um, is there a kind of a is it are you just looking for deeper nuances? Are there certain parts of the face that you're looking at?
So I love this question. And this already touches the subject to a depth that's sort of like, does it justice, right? And this is a complex question too. It's not a simple question. Um, and I'll tell you why I like it. Firstly, I like it because it helps us understand the meaning of human error, even when it comes to reading faces. So, my way of sort of like battling this is that I segregate different layers of physiognomy. So I use a three-layered system. The first layer is what I call the primal layer. It is the imprint layer. So just guessing and reading according to what you see, what the perfect imprint of a person's physiognomy and physiology actually is, right? The second and both of these are part of the formulaic layer, right? Because they combine into information. um, Now the second step is what I call the deviations layer. So now we know the imprint, or sort of have an idea of what the imprint is, and then we read how this person is currently or has deviated, if at all, from this imprint. And you can see that with features like you mentioned, right? Um, and the assumption there is that this imprint is where the person's highest good lies, right? And then the third one, which I call the mystical layer, but also the intuitive layer, is where the sort of like the acceptance and giving up happens. And when I say giving up, I mean giving up judgment and biases and intuitively trying to channel information by using the image of someone's face or physiognomy as a map of frequency and symbols. So it's like staring at a painting and deciphering information from it, a very similar thing, right? And this is sort of where the formulaic part stops. And you want it to stop because the formulaic part is weakened by your biases and past experiences and judgments and so on and so forth. So there's almost like this at the end of such a raw and primal and brutal art. I love this is a beautiful sort of like a beautiful undertone of acceptance and intuitive knowledge that is not given at all times and in all cases. It's intuitive knowledge that is gained sometimes, right? It's like insights that are given sometimes, but usually when they are, they're very meaningful. You can tell to, well, the person you're sort of like conveying the reading to, they're very deeply meaningful, even if to you they might make no sense, right? Let's say what I told you to me made very little sense, right? But I knew that for you somehow the message would have deeper meaning. And here we are.
It's very interesting. Would you say that when you are sitting either with video or photo of someone that you are face reading, is it something that you might kind of meditate on and return to over periods of time? Like, do you think that spending more time with the image of someone's likeness gives you ability to go deeper? Or do you think that there's kind of at some point a diminishing return or a limitation to what you can discern from a static image or even just one consistent video?
So the strongest readings happen on the very first time, like the first impression you get. So it's super important, because this is your first and the only first experience with sort of like the energy of someone, right? It's immediate, so it's felt the strongest. Later on, if you're not good at this and if you're not practiced well, it's sometimes difficult to determine whether something is your own bias or it's just part of someone's energy. And let's say when I try to share this knowledge with others, I always try to tell them like, don't, like, bullshitting others starts by bullshitting yourself, and you don't want to bullshit yourself that you're always sort of like getting it right, even on a formulaic level, right? um so the first time is very important, and later on, if you meditate on someone, it's also important not to overdo it. You don't want to overdo it. Sometimes you're just not getting the intuitive portion of it, and that's okay, right? Sometimes you just get the formulaic reading and you look at the shapes and you look at the size and you look at the sort of the basic metrics, right? The distance between things um, what you don't see on the face, what is expected for you to see on a physiognomy with someone with such traits, and then you don't see something. So sometimes the absence of a thing, right? The absence of a feature tells you more than, well, if something was there in the first place. Um, but just ultimate non-negotiable honesty um is the key to mastering, I guess, this art and practicing it like regularly. Sometimes I get burnt out too, you know, sometimes because it's a lot to look at and it's a lot to, if you make one assumption that's wrong and then you build like logically build on top of an assumption that's incorrect, you're not going to have a correct reading. So you have to understand that whatever primary assumptions you make, and usually this is like one, two, or three things, everything has to be based upon those assumptions because they feel the most true when it comes to this person, right? And everything else is guesswork that you're trying to pinpoint by understanding different facets of the face, right? Let's say with you, um, one of the primary ones, right? But when I look at your physiognomy, I immediately know that you're someone who's highly intuitive, right? You're an intuitive person. And the second intuitive insight that I got is that you're a very water-based person. And you mentioned, like you've been researching, Atlantis, so on and so forth. What is Atlantis associated with? Like it's the element of water. The element of water is a mirror into the subconscious, right? It also serves as a mirror for the soul. Water is it also retains memory, right? So I guess my message to you was, right, like dive deeper into the waters of your own, the depths of your own psyche and your own unconscious or subconscious or whatever we want to call it. um and those two things for me are more than enough to get the rest of the reading correct, right? I can tell you what kind of temperament you have, or like you're easy to communicate to with, right? You have very adaptable, flowy energy, right? You're not an ego-driven person. You're not a person who puts his ambitions over the ambitions of others. This makes you a good communicator and a good diplomat, right? Um, we had a good diplomatic exchange before we started this conversation, which was nice. It made it easier for me, someone who's, let's say less experienced talking in these types of settings. It made me feel more welcome, right? You are agreeable to a degree that makes other people feel safe and secure, right? So we have all of these traits. Now I also know how to communicate with you. Do I have to sort of like strong arm you into listening to me and showing, ethics when it comes to, like curiosity and things like that? No, I don't. And this allows the flow of information better. Now, if your physiognomy was different, right? Um, then I would say, okay, it's going to be relatively difficult to talk to this person without, let's say, having to talk over them, or just have more disagreeable moments. That's going to be a very, they're going to be a character, and that's going to be an interesting conversation as well in its own way, in an entertainment type of way. But when it comes to transferring knowledge and wisdom, yeah, maybe not so much, right? So, you're here, you have a wonderful podcast, right, that you're doing. You're in your element, and that's why you're doing it, right? All of these things are, it's the very basic truths that we can determine from your physiognomy, among many others.
It's interesting, and I would say definitely very impressive, and a lot of that resonates, which we can definitely go into. But I want to circle back to where you kind of started that point, which is you touched on saying like I make essentially kind of 2 to 3 fundamental base assumptions. Are those all assumptions existing on that primal layer? And also, what are you looking at to give you those initial assumptions that you're then extrapolating from?
So, how the human body is constructed? It's constructed by archetypal energies, and this is true for any art, any esoteric art, or any occult art. These archetypal energies, they're intuitively known to some people, or some people, study it sort of like what I call the left hand way, which is, like, big books and whatever. And some just know it intuitively. Now, these archetypal energies all have, well, let's say, I don't like using chakras, but for people to understand better, like, consider each chakra an archetypal energy, right? And these energies are located in different portions, or on different portions of the human body. And very much like astrology, have like, this house and that house, and this sign and that sign. Same thing. It's a fractal. Um, our three-dimensional world is of fractal design. It means that its pattern becomes recycled infinitely. So it follows the same pattern. Everything. So be it, human design, be it the cosmos and space, be it human technology, be it the single most biological thing, um, a single cell organism. All of these things follow the same pattern, but they are at different stages of said pattern. And they, well, because we live in a linear time space, they sort of they sort of happen simultaneously, but they're at different stages of well, birth and death, transformation. You could say the same thing for souls, and you could say the same thing for bodies and people, right? Always like to say that, when you read someone's physiognomy, you're sort of seeing where they are. I'm sorry, you're not seeing where they are, you're seeing where they're going. Um, and where they are is actually like far more into the future than when they're going. So even little things can give away, sort of like the inner workings of a person's mind. But to get to more specifics, let's say the for the primal layer, we look at what I call the canvas of the face. So we look at the outer shell, the bone matter in your face and your skull. What kind of shape is it, right? Does it have more triangles? Does it have more spherical influence? Does it have more square influences? And I'll tell you right now, because I've posted this publicly, um, understanding the meaning behind the circle, the square, and the triangle, and their advanced forms being the pyramid, the cube, and the sphere. Understanding what underlying energies they reference is the key to the pattern. And once you understand the pattern, you understand every art. So not just physiognomy. Then it's only a matter of like what you want to dive into more, where your interest lies. But once you understand how these three energies communicate and interweave with one another in infinite continuity, it becomes very easy to read symbols, to read letters. You could take a dead language and read it, right? If it's a real language that holds wisdom and knowledge, because when you see it, you just see the these elements, these archetypal energetic elements, right? That's what you're looking for. You're not looking for a specific meaning, but you're looking for these referenced elements. To give a very brief explanation, um, the the sphere is an enhancing or augmenting energy. It is the most flowy, it is the most adaptable, right? If you put an item on top of a circle or a sphere, it's going to slide down. So it allows energy, even the energy we don't see in our three-dimensional world, to flow freely and to increase. Um, then you have the square shape or the cube, and what the square does, it constrains energy within itself. It keeps the outer energy out and the inner energy in, as I like to say, right? And if you look, let's say, in life, or how human civilization has made intuitive use of these geometric figures, right? We look at apartments and houses, and why are they square? Why are they not triangular? Why are they not spherical? Right? Because not only in the material world they logically and rationally support orderliness and cleanliness and ease of movement, right? But also in a spiritual sense, in a symbolic sense. This is not knowledge we carry, within ourselves intuitively. We know that, let's say, an apartment should be, a square, rectangularly shaped. Um, and then you have the triangular energy, which has the least intensity, so the least full amount of energy, and the most intensity and accuracy and how to say um, direction. So it is a shape that directs energy, right? You look at the pyramids and so on and so forth. Even the shape, the basic shape of a triangle, especially on the end, um, um, on the end which is elongated, right? That is to direct energy. And all three of these shapes, you have to have a sort of intuitive relationship with these shapes and their meanings. And you can then decipher the meanings of different geometry and different shapes um, once you know these three.
So I assume that the circle and the sphere is the feminine and the triangle and the pyramid is the masculine. Is the square and cube reality or union?
That's a great question as well. Um, I wouldn't necessarily, I would call them the building blocks of life. And of course, there's an archetypal feminine and an archetypal masculine energy, but there's also a third energy that when the masculine and the feminine meet, they're constantly creating, right? This is sort of like the divine spark of life. And feminine and masculine charges can be sort of like interwoven and connected in different ways. So while we can say that, let's say, the square shape on someone's physiognomy, right? Like a lot of squares, they create a more traditionally masculine force, or what we understand to be traditionally masculine. Then yeah, on that level we would be correct. If we say, someone who has a lot of spherical influence on their physiognomy, are they more feminine of well, let's see, if it's a man, are they more feminine? But I would, you know, in a hypocritic way, I would disagree with that too. Um, I don't think that's how these energies manifest. I think they're just how we render, how our bodies render this energy, right? That's sort of like coming in, and how we transmute that energy, that masculine and feminine, which is within all of the shapes and all of us, right? It's just, imagine working with the same energy but having a different instrument every time, or a different set of instruments, right? Or a set of tools on how you can interpret this energy. This is what this layer, the imprint layer, feels like, when you read it. When you look at someone's skull, and like I differentiate, let's say, the warrior and the hunter archetype in the males, right? The warrior archetype being sort of like a male specimen that prioritizes upgrading the frontal portion of the skull, meaning the jaw and the wideness of the mouth palate, and the teeth, and like almost like a stubby nose, right? Smaller ears. Evolutionarily, if you look at this, well, what is this good for? Well, it's good for combat and survival, and chewing very tough foods, and very like hard to consume sustenance, right? That's why it's good for, right? If you look at a very uninformed opinion when it comes to this archetype, it's that oh, this is the healthy male arc, this is the masculine male archetype. But I completely disagree, because the other archetype, which I call the hunter archetype, that does not have a flat back of the skull. These are two very different beings, right? But the same species, but these are two very different beings, which has an elongated skull. What this does evolutionarily, and by the way, you would be surprised by the lack of real empirical research when it comes to things like this. Evolutionary biology is a joke. It's a joke because it doesn't even try to attain information from the human body that it studies. There's not a single paper that I found in evolutionary biology that explains this very basic thing. And then to go back to that a little bit, I guess the hunter archetype, what it does, it takes a part of the jaw and the chin area. It takes um, bone matter from that, and it what it does to elongate the skull, so to elongate the senses, right? Hearing, smell, vision, so on and so forth. It takes bone from that part of the face, because evolutionarily it doesn't need it anymore. It doesn't need to chew hard foods anymore as much. It doesn't need to engage in direct combat as much. So it elongates the skull, right, to increase the intuitive and instinctual senses, right? It allows the brain to grow in a certain shape and form, right? And it dispenses all this matter to elongate the cranium, right? And then you see this archetype, right? And when the male body sort of like grows, it deposits, like, it's hard to explain this, and I might botch this on a biological level, so if any biologists are watching this, excuse me. But what it does in a fifth grader's understanding is it deposits X amount of testosterone in different places. And where this testosterone goes, right, is either the jaw or the chin, it is the back of the skull or the cranium, or the nose, right? So let's say we have someone who has a smaller receding chin, right? And they have an elongated skull, right? And then we have someone who has a flat back of the skull, like pure flat, right? And a very strong jaw, right? Like very square jaw. If I ask someone on the street, because this is what we've been programmed for, by the way. We've been programmed for this to see one archetype as superior and the other inferior. But the truth is way beyond that. It's so way beyond that that it's funny to me how we can take 50% of the male population and tell them that they're evolutionary not viable when they've survived exactly for as long as we have, if we belong to the other archetype. It's ridiculous to me.
Interesting. I mean, a lot you touched on a fair amount there. So the canvas of the face is kind of one of those base assumptions, or it's where you're starting, and that exists on the, as you say, kind of primal or imprint level. Um, what else are you looking at? And then additionally, I also want you to at least mention and then kind of briefly, I don't know if summarize is a fair word, but like explain the archetypes that you break out, because I imagine that's something that you've particularly developed rather than taken from a larger school of physiognomy. But if it is, then potentially where have you learned it, or what are the archetypes you're referring to? Because you mentioned two, but I imagine there's more.
So these are the two male archetypes. Females are even more complex than males when it comes to physiognomy. I haven't even mapped that out yet. And so there you look at two things on this primal layer. One is the frontal portion of someone's face. So let's say how we're looking at you right now, like from the front, we sort of like get a good idea of the canvas, right? Like the shape of the skull, the frontal shape. And then there's the profile, the side profile, right? And the side profile actually gives you very interesting insights. Yeah, there you go. So look at yours, right? We have a sort of flattened back of the head there, right? But we still have small curvature. We have slight curvature, right? And I would say you're a very good, let's say, hybridized version of both the warrior and the heart hunter archetypes. I would say you belong to the warrior archetype more, right? So this shows us what kind of temperament you have, sort of like how you like to take on things directly, how you have almost like this inherent bravery when it comes to like action and stuff like that. And it also shows us how it might come to conflict sometimes with your frontal imprint, which is far more intuitive and sort of like laid back and meditative, right? So let's say you're a man who's a man of action, right, by nature, and is someone who likes to take on things directly and likes to ground things in reality, and then sort of like sift through this knowledge. But you're also someone who, has good intuitive traits, and someone who has an introverted side to them, right? And these two energies might clash sometimes, but it also gives you this unique sort of perspective on life. You're also a generalist when it comes to knowledge. You are interested in details, so on and so forth. But I would say you're more interested in people than things, right? Um, and you like to derive knowledge from people and communication and a generalist understanding of everything rather than going into incredible depths into one area or one skill set of life, right? Again, it makes you a better communicator, right? It also makes you bold to ask the questions in the way you want to ask them. It makes you bold in the sense of like, you're not. One thing that I notice about you, for example, you're not afraid to offend people. You don't want to offend people, but you're not afraid to, right? Those two things are also very important for me, right? You can be very selfless in critical, sometimes even in life-threatening situations, right? You can be very selfless, and that gives you a confidence. And let's say when you walk into a room, people also feel that. People also feel the readiness that you impose um, on the room, right? They feel that, so you make other people feel secure and welcomed and protected. You have this protective energy about you as well. And I'm sure you resonate with this stuff, right? Like when I tell you this, like maybe people also, give you feedback and tell you these things on their own. Like, yeah, it's like so, like easy to let loose around you, or it's easy to like, like feel sort of like, comforted around you. These are all parts of what they're reading on an energetic and visual layer, thanks to past experiences and past reference, right? So they're just referencing the past. And like, let's say they've met other people like you and they've behaved certain types of ways and they made them feel certain types of ways. This is sort of like where they get that from. So the primal layer is the only layer that someone who doesn't has no clue about physiognomy can still read on almost like an instinct level, right?
That's very fascinating. And one thing this brings up, first of all, I appreciate the complementary nature of the reading. Um, and of course, many of these things resonate, some both from external feedback, but also from what I've kind of intuited about my nature, if you will. Because one of my biggest things in the work that I do and just content and kind of what I feel like my mission is getting people to lean into their nature. And I use a lot of language, and we'll get to the closer questions eventually. But like, finding what is your gift, what is your unique gift to give the world, and then dissolving into the giving of that gift for the rest of your life. Like, I'm a big believer that people are born for a reason, otherwise they would not have been born or created. And in that, we're presented with the opportunity to curiously seek that out, find it, and participate in it. And when we ignore that and potentially actively resist it, that is the root of a tremendous amount, if not all of our suffering, especially on kind of a spiritual level. Um, but like I mentioned to my numerology friend, and I think is important with a lot of these fractal schools that help us observe reality, like astrology, like numerology, and even physiognomy, a common criticism of these sorts of things is like it's all positive and general enough to work, right? If you were to use the exact same reading to,
Yes.
one of my male friends, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'm an intuitive Chad as well. I'm also a warrior. Like this is cool. It makes me feel good. I'm a protector archetype. All of these things." And while I obviously deeply resonate with what your description, and it's like super impressive considering this is the first time we're speaking, and you only have a photo and our Zoom call to go off of. I would also one of the things I wanted to ask basically is like, are there equivalent weaknesses to the strengths that you're
Yes.
listing?
Yes, yes. I love that you mentioned this as well, and this is ironically my primary criticism with the arts in general. I'm a very dualistic character, right? Even from the things that I post and so on and so forth. And there's a reason for that. Um, what I dislike about how even generally spirituality is practiced is that it is a total rejection of the self. And I feel like this is because a lot of people really wish to be love and light, or whatever they want to say. And when they say that, it makes me feel like they don't have, well, firstly, they're not informed about the spiritual tradition of the human race. And secondly, they don't understand a fundamental truth about the spiritual journey. And that fundamental truth is that when you go into light, you equally tread into darkness to the same degree. And until this is where the acceptance and non-judgment comes from for advanced consciousness and advanced soul, because what it tells you, it tells you that we are all equally light and dark. And once you can embrace this, you can then transmute yourself and your consciousness to the third energy, which is born out of these two. So you're not here to master love and light. You are here to master love, light, darkness, evil, everything, all of these elements. So um, when I started out with physiognomy, it used to be much more brutal. And to a degree, it might still be for certain people. Um, over time, while I agree with that criticism, I've learned that um we have to tread very carefully when it comes to being ultra honest, right, about certain things. Let's say when you do a reading for someone, largely because these things are either like very private or they're buried deep down, right? And when you're sort of like forcing someone to come face to face with something they themselves don't want to face, you know, it it becomes grounds for conflict and like disagreements. I'm not against conflict and disagreements. I think they're a good initiator for healing, right? And this is why sometimes I'll go out and I'll tell someone, man, you're a fucking idiot, right? And I can say that, and I can also say that, like uh, some people have a strange reaction to that. They're like, "Hey, Jack, you're supposed to be like very spiritual, and you're supposed to, you're supposed to be all about love and like this destiny of Earth. You talk about why are you calling someone an idiot? Well, it's good for the progression of their soul, right? That's usually like my answer. And yes, I do have the audacity to do it, because I feel like intuitively I should and can do it. So let's say, is there an equal weakness? No, I wouldn't call it a weakness. There is a trade-off if we're talking about, evolutionarily, right? But if we're talking about on a more mental and emotional level, there's also a psychotic version of it. There's also a dark and evil version of it. Like I know what your darkness is, right? We know what your darkness is very well, right? You can be a sensationalist sometimes. You can enjoy the suffering of others sometimes. You can bask in the non-well-being of the other and take joy from that in a very egocentric, hedonistic way. And you feel like you hide this very well, I'd say, right? And you can, let's say, go to great lengths. Um, I'm saying your darker side, right? This is like when you're not performing well in in your spiritual journey. Your darker side loves this, and he loves sometimes even sabotaging things, right? Indirectly. So it's a very indirect, your shadow side is a very indirect actor, right? It's like behind the scenes. It goes against you. That's why it goes against your imprint of boldness and bravery and sort of like rushing, wading into the fire, right? And your shadow side is actually, no one suspects if that I'm doing this because like, that type of thing. But that's that sensationalist side, right? It's basically like someone um who will let's say sabotage a situation or an event or something, right? On an emotional level, and then remove themselves from the situation or pretend like they never were part of the situation. And then they're also someone who will then carefully watch and observe and track the situation to sort of like vampirically transmute the sensation. So you do it for the sensation, right? Of like just watching other people go through intense experiences. Someone like and but I would say with you, this isn't like you don't represent these things, right? But it is your potential shadow side. Someone who very much leans into this, let's say a good example of it would be Mr. Beast, who I have many problems with, right? Like, as you might know from my posts, like he is a sensationalist vampire, the highest degree of someone who he thinks he's being very sneaky with it, but is actually not. And someone who enjoys transmuting the intense emotions and energy of others into his own success and sustenance. That is literally what he's made, uh, you know, his wealth out of, right? And you sort of like understand that these are like darker archetypes that sometimes like form within um, you know, um, human psyches that are not leaning into their imprint, that are going against their imprint, that type of thing. You understand that there's this shadow side that's to every person, and some people are very much leaned into it. Some people reject it wholly. So I would, the question here is, which is more advanced? Someone who completely has rejected their darker side, or someone who's leaning into their darker side? I would argue um, the latter is more on their way to spiritual progression than the former, right? And it's a big argument to make, but in my opinion, it's true. You can't just ascend into this you can't ascend into this bubble of light where you only accept your reality, right? The idea is that you are of higher consciousness coming into a non-conscious world. And if you want to make it conscious, then you also have to sort of like go through the mud and muck of that world, right? So you also have to get your hands dirty. There, there's there's no way you're coming in here and yeah, you're going out without getting your hands dirty. That's what a lot of these sort of like spiritualists and spiritual quote unquote gurus or masters don't seem to understand. They think they're on some plane, sitting on a cloud somewhere, but yeah, it's not that easy, man.
Yeah, no, I really love that you brought up that kind of love and light phenomena. I'm of the opinion that the reason it's so pervasive is that it's a planted psyop. It's essentially like a spiritual holding pen that's just comfortable enough that people won't kind of want to break out of it. They're comfortable to go sit in the grass and pull tarot cards and
Because it's
talk.
easy.
It's easy, right? It's easy, it's comfortable, but it's extremely limiting to your potential. And it's kind of like it's self-cucking. It's just putting these people in a placated state, but they'll never be able to reach their full potential because, like you're alluding to, is there's no integration of the two halves. And also it's I think when you observe it removed from a distance, it becomes very plain that it's very anti-life. It's like anti-natalist in nature because it's a rejection of what we're experiencing, which is what you're saying. Like, look to nature and our reality. It is gorgeous and beautiful, and we can bask in the beauty of a landscape or a waterfall or a beautiful night sky, and that's beautiful and amazing. But simultaneously, under that night sky, animals and predators are ravaging their prey and tearing them piece by piece and
Yes. Limb
relishing in
to
the
limb.
sinew and just so nature is it's both, it's all of it. It's this neutral amoral kind of arena, and we are participating in this physical experience. And I think a lot of the love and light narrative is that, like, yeah, you're supposed to just perma meditate or perma be just swimming in the present moment and it's just always going to feel good. But by nature, you are rejecting the gift of the physical experience. You're here for it all. And I think that the more that I've internalized that, because I definitely had a brief but meaningful arc of kind of the spiritual side, like believing into the love and the light stuff, because it does feel good. I think also for Western men, especially, you're not really raised in a framework typically, and I certainly wasn't, where you're all allowed to just be. Like the feminine aspect is just not, there's no container for it. So the first time that somebody gives you permission, they're like, hey, you don't have to do something to be worthy of love. The first time you feel that, it's amazing. It's almost like overwhelmingly so. And so what I reflect though is that that era for myself probably resulted in 6 to 8 months of creating absolutely nothing. And
Yes.
it left me feeling very empty because it's very much just kind of material, mushy, feel good, but there's no achieving, there's no self-actualization, there's no building there. It's very empty. And so I think returning to that middle ground where you're harnessing the two halves is super important. And it's interesting the what you talked about with my shadow, because I try my best when I listen to this sort of stuff to be as earnest with the feedback as possible so that I hopefully can take something from it. I
Yeah.
can't think of a material example of myself, even as honest as I can be, relishing in the sensationalist emotion or pain of some other people. I think the closest thing I could draw is potentially self sabotage. Like, patterns or behaviors in my life where I've done something that I know is a lower self action
Good.
or remaining in it to then spend time in that, like you talked about, the self-reflective or the observation state.
Yeah.
Um, that's the closest I can think of because I can't think of
Good,
a
good.
moment externally. But if that's equivalent or what you're describing, then I think that counts.
I think that's a good thing because largely I think the less that is expressed, the better for you. How it is initially expressed, and I guess what the root of that is that you sometimes like to be in awe of intense emotion. And sometimes self-sabotage serves to create that intense or extreme emotion to inflict that state of awe, right? Um, um, onto the self. A lot of people who are in these spiritual circles also seem to share that, especially the ones who are into like DMT trips and ayahuasca and all that. They're addicted to this intense emotional input that they're receiving, right? They're so starved and hungry for it. I and like I said with you, I don't think this part is expressed very much, and I urge you to explore this part. I urge you to explore it in a non-judgmental way, or not even like in a forceful manner, but I urge you to explore this, and I think you'll find facets of your psyche that you haven't come across. Maybe you will. I believe you will, but I also could be wrong. Um, that's also there. What we mentioned about human error and what we mentioned about, you know, you, quoting you, you said, you don't have to do this thing or anything to be worthy of love. Now, ultimately, this is true, but is this something that I would tell my child once? Yes. Is it something that I would tell them on a regular basis? Absolutely not. It is, if you want a man to achieve nothing and be nothing and do nothing, this is what you tell them, right? The male psyche needs the sustenance, it needs the competitive environment that is going to inspire action from him to become worthy, to make oneself worthy. This means if I can sit in a nice room all day meditating, right? For all I know, like, okay, Zach, I'll tell you directly, for all you know, you're a piece of shit because you haven't gone out there and put yourself in the mud and muck. You haven't um explored who you are in those terrible environments, those terrible situations, those very dark and heavy and weighted, very material, very primal, very brutal environments, right? And someone who's gone and done that, right? In comparison to someone who's just sat in a nice room and this is how these people want to live their lives, right? Like this is the message of like, do nothing, be nothing, do no wrong. You're not here to do no wrong. You're here to learn what your shadow is. You are here to grasp the darkest truth of your psyche, because if you cannot come face to face with that, you cannot advance to the next level. So I always, in a funny way, make fun of these people. They'll climb a mountain and they'll meditate themselves into transcendence, and like, have you transcended yet? Is your body gone? Have you ascended to the next density or the next one? No, you haven't. Wow, I wonder why, right? And it's so funny because like some people literally die in a meditative state. They die meditating. And it's probably, this is the comical nature of reality itself, right? They wake up, being aggressively shoved out of their new mother's wombs, right? And they're like, wait, I didn't transcend. No, pal, you have a lot of work to do here. You have a lot of work to do here. You go back down from that mountain, right? You go back down, put yourself where you were born, because a lot of people want to escape the place that they're born in, but you have to be living in the place that you're born in. This is my belief, because you were born in this place for a reason, right? You have to remain there for X amount of years, right? Or some amount of time, because there's lessons for you to be learned there. So someone who's born in, let's say Africa, they have to experience that. They have to experience that, because that is what will drive awareness into their life and into their soul. That is what will drive their darkness. It will externalize their darkness. And a lot of people ask me, like, Jack, you have like very strong ideas about like what's going on in the world right now, and why are these things happening and why are they occurring? They are occurring because they need to be occurring, because without these incredible external stimulants, most of humanity is incapable of externalizing their own darkness. So what our world, which is basically a three-dimensional mirror world, what it is attempting to do, it is attempting to give us grand theater, the grand theater of life and politics and war and conspiracy and so on and so forth, for us to finally be not stupid to a degree to understand that all of these dark and evil things that we see in our world as separate and external from us actually are problems and dark voids that exist within our collective psyche. The moment humanity understands this simple truth, then we can talk about moving to the next level. While we're still killing one another, and we mentioned nature, right? What nature shows it shows you the dualistic distinction between the non-aware material primal world and its beauty, right? And its grandeur. And it also shows you, look, this tiger is ripping its prey from limb to limb. This is the survival of the fittest. But here you are now, a thinking, breathing, living, conscious human being. How will you upgrade and elevate from this? How will you firstly interpret the beauty of nature, which is also a part of who you, and what you are. But how will you upgrade from this? What is your counter argument against the Garden of Eden? Because what is the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden is, like you described, a perfectly meditative, non-aware state of like this stillness and bliss, but bliss that comes with unrealized potential. Now, a lot of religious thinkers, they seem to understand what I think they seem to misunderstand the 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 biblical myth. They seem to see Adam and Eve falling from or departing from the Garden of Eden as something regressive, and they see it as something they want to return to. So they want to return to this state of being wholly accepted and loved by God in the state of non-awareness. But the truth is, that is not a regression. It's a progression. It's a progression because now Adam and Eve, becoming aware of their own faults and their faulty design and their quote unquote sins and their own darkness, they must rediscover in conscious awareness who and what they wish to be. And the moment they return to the garden, right, they don't deserve it. So they have to build the garden. They have to rebuild the garden. But this time, they will be gifted with the conscious awareness of existing within the that state of blissfulness, that state of bliss under creation, right? So if you look at life from that perspective, you could say we're in a very big classroom. Everything ultimately matters, right? um and everything is workable in a sense where we all know that we get many chances in this life. If not in this life, then in the next, right? um but that doesn't mean creation is not going to let you, sit on your laurels and spend and waste so much energy and so much time convincing yourself that you're of higher consciousness than you are. Because if you were, the moment you become heightened in consciousness is the moment your physical three-dimensional body loses its primary function. It has no function anymore. Then what are you doing here, right? If you've advanced to the next degree, so to speak, right? So if we are here, if we're on this earth, including you, me, and the smartest, most enlightened person on this planet, we're still babies. We're still children. And we all have at least 50% of a shadow side. So yeah, is everyone full of shit? Yes, absolutely. And that's good.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you touched on so much. I like. I'll jump in on the biblical thing. I think uh, this past year I endeavored to actually read the entire Bible. I was raised in Christian home, Christian education, but hadn't actually read the story. And I'm not a self-identified Christian. Definitely not now. Certainly wasn't at the outset of that project last year. But there's an interesting interpretation of the Eden story specifically. One thing to notice when you read Genesis is that the serpent is only called just the serpent. Often, at least in the Protestant interpretation that I was raised in, it's just assumed that it's Satan or the enemy, the deceiver, but it is never explicitly stated. And one of the cooler interpretations I've found is that that was actually Christ or Christ consciousness in the garden because it had to happen. The fall had to happen. And so it was in this grand story, like necessary for that, the evolution of man. And similarly, I don't know that you, if you have, but I would really recommend you to read the Space Trilogy from C.S. Lewis because he, in a really beautiful story, plays out the creation myth in this kind
Mm,
of sci-fi esque way. But especially in the close of the third book and the entry of the first, he's kind of addressing the dawn of Adam and Eve. And I don't know, it's just really, really beautiful. So I recommend that to you and to anyone um, who's interested in that. And it's a beautiful experience. And additionally, my favorite quote, which came to mind, which at the outset of kind of what you were saying before about choosing as a man, like to be a participant, you have to go into the arena. The intro and outro of this podcast are snippets from the Teddy Roosevelt speech, "Man in the Arena." But my favorite quote is from Nietzsche, which is, "Wisdom is a woman, and she loves only the warrior." And as somebody who, I have this podcast, I'm a pursuer of truth. I fancy myself someone who's decently smart. I like to learn things. It's a reminder that true wisdom, not just knowledge, but true wisdom is found in the arena alone. It's through the actual entry into the arena of life, the doing of things, the experience
yes.
of it all. It's not about reading masculine and feminine nature. It's about falling in love. It's not about reading about how to build a business. It's about building a business and going
Building a
bankrupt,
business.
right? It's
Yes.
I just love that because it's a constant reminder that as much as I love to play in the realm of ideas and have these discussions with quote unquote enlightened beings and whatever else, it's not too much to kid yourself. It's a reminder to go out and like, scrape your knees a little bit, um, and muddy yourself, as is the point of this whole kind of thing. Is like have a little bit of fun with it and be brave and be daring and go out and be bold because that's where true wisdom is won.
I love that. I feel like um touching this subject, it causes resistance in most people I talk to. And it's a simple thing, right? It is a thing as simple as go out there and do something. And when resistance comes to this, right? Um, like I always tell people, like you're given X amounts of energy per day. What equation you use this energy for is very much up to you, but you will not be allowed to not use that energy. You will not be allowed because that will only go internally and it will manifest as depression. Um, the resistance I get from, those I consider to be highly intellectual, like individuals who are also into the spiritual fields is incredible to me. And I always tell them the most spiritually advanced people are the ones who are living the most normal, in our understanding, normal lives because they're going through their scenarios in the grand theater of life. They're playing their role. They're going every day. There's a different challenge. There's a different struggle, right? Because they're doing things. And you and I, we can be about appearances all we want. We can sit in our high castle somewhere, right? And, imagine like figures of light, just, like whatever. But how much of that are you executing in the material, in the physical? Because you're not in this world to master the mental. You've already mastered that. You're here to master the physical, the material, because guess what? And that also hints at the larger meaning of, our life here, which, is a crazy extensive topic that probably don't want to get into, but it also hints at, well, what the function of this realm even is, right? It is here to teach us the lessons of the material plane, because the next level, when we do go to the next spiritual or consciousness level, we are not going to be working on the spiritual and consciousness level. We're going to be working on the physical and material level, right? This is why we need to learn these things, because we need to learn the appreciation of of things experienced in linearity, in a linear setting, right? Where action and reaction are removed from one another. It's not instantaneous, right? And things like pain can exist. Things like impatience can exist, right? Those things can only exist, even faith, like these things can only exist in a three-dimensional realm. They cannot exist in a realm that doesn't experience time in a linear manner, right? But yeah, there's no need to go into these very deep spiritual experiences. I see them as personal experiences. I can share them with people such as yourself who are on the same journey, so on and so forth, right? I can share with you of like my astral travels and so on and so forth, and meeting other, sentient consciousness and stuff like that. But what matters for the average person, right, is you have to practice authenticity, but actually practice it on a daily basis. Like you have to go out and do it. You have to face life. You have to make mistakes. What the universe wants you to be is your authentic self. And through that, it can teach you the lessons of this world, right? So it's always funny to me, um, because I feel like my introduction to the lighter part of spirituality was through my understanding of myself as someone who's completely unworthy, right? Someone who, let's say, I get vision dreams, and I will receive these intuitive insights, and I'm like, if I were to objectively sort of like judge, I'm someone who's I consider to be unworthy of these things, right? If there was a worthy God or a worthy creator, um, they would, back in the day, this is how I thought, like, why would they give me these things? And then it sort of like dawned on me. Then I understood that um, the ultimate display of universal, absolute love and acceptance is how to say, to make a friend out of your enemy, in that sense, where it is the half sinner and the half saint that is given initiation when it comes to the higher realms, and higher learning and higher wisdom. So because I consider myself relatively unworthy, and because I am given what I am given, let's say these experiences and insights, um, it, it is the most compelling force that can possibly exist in this realm, to urge and inspire me to do better, and give me a reason to be ethically and morally straight, right, as a male. Where the other side of that is, I could have gone and become a cult leader or something, right? Um, and while I mention this, I'll mention this as well, because I say this a lot. A lot of people take this the wrong way, especially people who have spiritual ego, right? With, oh, I know so many things, and have you read this book, and have you read that book, and yada yada. If you have a guru, guru, or let's say like a spiritual master or teacher or whatever, ask them, what is the meaning of life? What is the function of living? And if they cannot, like two things, okay, if they cannot give you an objective meaning, an objective truth, that's one. And two, if they cannot prove the meaning of life and the proof of God's existence, then they are a fraud. And people hate when I say this. People hate when I say this, but how can I not say it when I know that there is objective proof of God that exists, that is provable, empirically provable. And then there's also an objective way to both meditate and prove the function of this realm. So someone who is spiritually inclined and someone who says they're, like in a higher state of consciousness, they should know these truths. If they tell you something like, well, everyone has their own truth and it depends on how you look at it, and we make our bullshit. Well, you have a lot of work to do, right? So even though these people have spiritual egos, I treat them as students. And someone who tells me a strong argument or sort of like an objective argument, um, and they're closer to, I found that like the average person is closer to the objective meaning of life, the objective proof of God, than most people who consider themselves spiritually inclined, which is funny, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's the tendency of just over intellectualization. Like if it's going to exist in the head space, you've gone too far. And I think that's kind of the shadow aspect of like you kind of alluded to, like the left hand path. Too much study is also a bad thing. Like it is important for us to study and to learn, but it can't only exist in the realm of ideas in books. And additionally, another thing that I have kind of intuitively started to glean is that the religious schools, the spiritual schools, and all these different mystery traditions, it's pretty easy to discern which ones are the good guys versus the bad guys, or which ones come from God and which ones come from the enemy or the demiurge or however you want to constellate that evil, because the evil side will always make it seem mysterious and complicated and have layers and systems and levels and all this different flowery complicated language. And it's like what's coming to mind immediately when we're having this conversation is the midwit meme, right? Like everybody
Yes.
exists under the bell curve, and the enlightened being recognizes that the very ooga booga person is
Yeah.
right the entire time, which is that something to the effect of God is love and I was born for a reason. And on the other end, after you've done the study, you've entered the woods, you've gone and tread the dark path, you realize that, yeah, God is love. I'm here for a reason. It's the same conclusion. Some people I recognize in myself, for instance, I couldn't avoid having to go through all of the stuff. And certain other people who I sometimes very much envy, they just don't even need to. Like I had this conversation with my friend Nolan, he a few episodes back on the podcast, and he was talking about sometimes he spends time in kind of the rural area of like for hunting here in Georgia in the US, and he says he meets these very traditional Southerners, and they're just good, down to earth family people, like high
Yes.
value individuals. And I made the comment, like, because he was talking about these people never think about these ideas, right? They don't pontificate on these philosophies or whatever, and it's like the person that kind of guy, that country bumpkin dude who has a great family, a great life, just lives happy. He's never going to read Nietzsche, but he doesn't
Yeah.
need to read Nietzsche. Like he doesn't
Yes.
need to think about like the difference between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's interpretation of the higher man. Like it just doesn't even enter his awareness. But like you're saying, that guy is probably more spiritually inclined than the academic
Closer.
that's
Closer to
writing
the truth, for
exactly.
sure. Well,
Um,
we spoke about Adam and Eve, in a regressive state and in a progressive state, right? The initial state of bliss, those people are in the initial state of bliss. They're far closer to heaven than someone who's very educated about these subjects, but they've removed themselves from that state of bliss. But the problem with the ego, is that before they reach the other part of the midway meme, right? The other end of it, right? They are convinced that they figured everything out, and that's a scary place to be, and that's a place where I find myself in for a small period of my life as well, and then just crash down onto me because, well, we have different destinies and we have different urgencies that the universe gives us. And for me, I feel like for a lot of spiritual guides and teachers who sort of like already know that they're here to teach others, we don't get a lot of classroom time, right? So it's a direct slap in the face, right? So the life is usually like very traumatic and very difficult to maneuver because of that reason, because you're expected to do it quickly, because you're not really learning, you're remembering, right? And because you have that luxury, life is like, okay, you've done this before, go on, do your thing now, stop bopping around. um but that's a great example you bring up, because um the the both ends of light and dark are absolutely misunderstood by most people. So they see dark as a force of evil or symbol of evil, and they see light as a force of goodness and virtue, right? But light and dark are just the masculine and feminine. They're the twin energies that make up this world. They're not inherently bad or good. That's what people don't understand, right? Like dark and light can be molded into a third energy, right? It's like a prism. But if you want to see the truth of a thing, then you have to understand both its masculine qualities to the depths at which they're expressed, and their feminine qualities to the depths at which they're expressed. Both of these forces are present in everything, right? Even in the human mind, in the human psyche, right? Like the more you know, the more you don't know. That's what that means, right? The more things you've grasped, an equal amount of things become existence that you have not grasped. Same thing for, like when you reject darkness as evil, that's the biggest mistake highly intellectual people make who have no degree of spirituality. When you leave no space for the mystical to occur, the mystical will not occur. And people who are into the scientific and logical method, right, of like determining the truths of life, they don't understand that they are the primary driver of what happens in. Okay, tell you like this, okay? We live in a mirror world. What does that mean? So it means whatever you input into this realm, it will output that thing back onto you. So if you input, I figured everything out, I know exactly what everything is, guess what? It's going to feed your biases. It's going to output the same external information to you. And it's going to show you that, yeah, you know everything, Zach. Yeah, that guy's an asshole. This should be like that. That should be like this. It feeds your biases. And the only way out of that rut is to honestly and genuinely be able to admit to yourself that there are many things that I do not know. Do not fear the unknown, but understand that the unknown is always there. And when you can mystify and blur the lines between what you do actually know and the things that you're unsure of, that is where you invite the third energy, the mystical, to occur in your life. That is when miracles happen in your life, right? When you can surrender to the idea that regardless of me knowing so much, I actually know very little, probably, right? You always have to not pretend, but understand that there is a depth beyond the depth at which you are receiving information from external visual stimuli in life, right? And that makes a fractal. What the ego version of the world, what the ego likes to make of the world is a hypercube, right? In its four-dimensional state, which is a prison realm. If you research the symbolism behind the cube, right? It's a prison realm. And that's how it wants to conceive the world, right? Oh, it's like this, matrix that I'm stuck in, and the matrix is feeding on my energy and, yada, yada. While technically and mechanically on certain levels of reality that might be true, that is a disservice to the whole truth, right? Because the whole truth is much, much stranger, right? And much more grandiose than that.
Completely agree. Well, Jack, this has been amazing. I do want to be respectful to the listeners. I think we could go on, and I look forward to future conversations as well. But one thing before I get into the closer questions of the podcast, I do want to return to physiognomy where we began the conversation.
Yeah.
Based on my face, what is some high level recommendations, or if you were to be giving me a reading, what would you say to me or about me as like closing words?
Um, yeah, that's a big ask, and we definitely steered away from. But the funny part is that all of this relates to physiognomy as well.
Exactly.
Physiognomy also relates. It's a fractal form, and I guess what I could tell you on an intuitive and maybe even formulaic sense. mm, I think where you are on your journey, it's very important to understand the law of paradoxes. It's very important to understand that the level you're reaching is to understand that both light and dark serve your advancement, and to not fear either sides of life, and that the true enemy of sanity and truth is confusion and insanity, which means the the removal of oneself from objective truths and objective reality. So it's very important to understand that while you are having a subjective experience in your life and in your spiritual journey, and you can input things onto your journey, I think it's very important for you to also understand that if you do not surrender to the objective reality of things, then you cannot interpret its subjective elements well enough. Where pain comes from, and let's do like closing words type of thing. So I think as an example, you understand what I mean here better. If I raise a child in a dark cave and I teach them that water is fire and fire is water, right? The moment they go out of the cave, right, and they see fire and they try to drink it, right, it'll burn their tongue, it'll burn their mouth and hands, it'll cause pain. I will have caused them this pain because I have taught them wrong things about objective reality, right? This is where most pain comes from for people who are on the spiritual journey, because they subjectively want to believe things that are not objectively true. And the moment they have to face these things, the moment they like to pretend that fire is water and water is fire, and that they can transmute these things which are part of the collective reality of this world, right? They get burnt and they experience pain. And even this pain is a cleansing pain, right? Because it shows you where you've been dishonest with life, with the world. So for your advancement, according to your physiognomy, you have to ground yourself, go back to understanding what objectively is real, what objectively is true. You can use logic-based arguments for it as well. And sort of like surrendering to the objective truths of life will allow you to also understand where it is not objective and it is subjective, in what you can input onto the existing collective reality, right? That's what I would tell you. It's a little bit abstract, but I feel like that's the primary message you'd like to hear, or your higher potential would like to hear. Um, but yeah, I don't want to dramatize it into something that it is not. Just focus more on what's objectively true in your life with, the people you communicate with, the relationships that you have, so on and so forth. And don't lie to yourself, man. Yeah, it's easier said than done, but try not to lie to yourself about, some things in life, about like where you, where you want to be, what your true desires are. Maybe explore that shadow side that we talked about a little bit too, to get like a better understanding, and embrace the paradox. This screwed up, confusing plane that we're on. But the cool part is like everything is possible. But only if you can surrender to the objective lessons it's trying to teach you. Yeah, because you're not gonna get to that next level, and I feel like you're collecting this knowledge to get to that next level, right? Because you want to experience those things that are on that next level. You're not gonna get there by, like I said, imagining figures of light, right? You have to get down and dirty, with the rest of us, which you are doing, I'm not talking to you from a point of like, oh, like, I'm at this stage. No, no, it's just like a friend to a friend. It's what I would advise you very humbly. Thanks for having me on. We can close in if you have any more questions remaining. I don't mind it. It's
Yeah,
been a really cool conversation.
of course, dude. And I'm super pleased with where the conversation's gone, and I will definitely meditate on that feedback and see. There's already a few things in my kind of awareness that are coming up, and I definitely think it's a timely message as well. So I appreciate it greatly, and I appreciate your time. But I do have three closer questions that I ask every single guest on this podcast. So the first of the three is, if you could go back to a younger version of yourself and tell him one thing, what would that be?
What would that be? I've had this question asked to me like several times, and I answer it differently every time. And sometimes, usually, it's something very sentimental, right? But now I'm coming from an understanding that, whatever my younger self went through had to go through those things so that we could be having this conversation right now. So I would tell you nothing. I would tell them nothing. Absolutely not. I wouldn't tell them anything. I just let them be.
I really like that. Secondly, what is one quote that has always stuck with you or that you try to live by?
These are not easy. I would say one quote that I try to live by: if you don't burn, you don't shine.
Nice. I like that. And then finally, what do you believe is your unique gift to give the world?
Definitely not my terrible sense of humor. I'll tell you that much. I believe I'm a good example, firstly, of someone who has a lot of dark potential, and someone who comes from having realized that dark potential, both in partially in this life and in previous ones. I think, firstly, I'm a good example of someone who has sort of like touched both ends of the spectrum. Um, but also, I'm someone who sees themselves as an initiator of healing. But I don't want to be. I know that I'm not someone who's supposed to be on the main stage, right? I'm not the main player. I'm sort of like the person who makes slight influential but slight changes behind the scenes. Um, so I feel I'm just a humble initiator of healing for those who are open to listen and are open to um, see a little bit more depth in my more questionable actions than not. Yeah, that's how I'd put it.
It's a very fascinating answer and I think very fitting for this conversation. Jack, I appreciate your time. Where can the people find more of your work and what are you working on that you're excited about?
Um, Follow me on X or Twitter, whatever we want to call it, at Jack of Faces. I'm currently working on a second portion of a formulaic physiognomy sort of like guidebook the first one of which I already released. If you want to support me, purchasing that is the best way to do so, or just buy a reading, like a face reading session or something. But yeah, I'm excited working on the second piece. It's an incredibly challenging thing for me, um, because I have to sort of like come up with new terminology and details that are just non-existent in physiognomy. So there's nothing to reference, and I'm trying to be very, very, very cautious about like with how I go about it. Um, but it's coming along really well, and hopefully it'll be done and released soon, and we can sort of have a basic reference to these truths in physiognomy and face reading that I would like to share with the world. So that's what I'm excited about. But I'm excited about life and just taking it day by day too, man. It's something that I've been teaching myself all over again to like treat life as an adventure. And I'm really excited about that too. Today's been really cool, thanks to you. Largely here. And yeah, I wish everyone a happy and entertaining life, I guess.
Amazing. Well, like I said, I appreciate you, Jack, and I also appreciate anyone that's made it thus far to the end. I always want to shout out the people that make it this far. You can continue to listen on any platform that you found this on, whether that be YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or any podcast player. Subscribe to the YouTube channel for the behind the scenes vlogs and additional content as well. Obviously, you can follow on any social platform, X, Instagram, that you find interesting, posting content there. And of course, the top link on the news of the description will be the newsletter, the Vitruvian.co. You can sign up for updates in my universe as well as upcoming brand information for launches. And yeah, I appreciate you spending your attention, your most valuable resource with myself and Jack today. Memento Mori, be the Renaissance, and I'll see you in the next one.
And if he fails, at least fails while daring greater, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.